You know, we think of many things when you hear the word molasses, especially in Canada, because great cooks, it's considered a substitute for people who are low on vitamins, iron. You can put it on bread, you can add it to a lot of stuff. But did you know at one point, ladies and gentlemen, that molasses became a heavy danger in a part of the Boston region, and that danger turned to a real disaster? And there's no other way to explain this. I present the information not to make light of it. This was a very, very unforeseen way this ended, and it killed a lot of people, and it drew a lot of ire, and the reason why it happened in the first place. So today we're going to be talking about the Great Molasses Flood. Now, this is also known as the Boston Molasses Disaster or the Boston Molasses Flood. It occurred on January 15, 1919 in the North End neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. Now, because there was a large storage tank filled with 2.3 million U.S. gallons of molasses, weighing approximately 13,000 short tons, or 12,000 tons, it reached capacity and went past it. The storage tank eventually burst, and the resulting wave of molasses rushed through the streets at 35 miles an hour, killing 21 and injuring 150. Now, the event entered local folklore, and residents claimed for decades afterwards that the area still smelled of molasses on hot summer days. Now, the disaster occurred at the Purity Distilling Company facility at 529 Commercial Street near Keeney Square. Molasses can be fermented to produce ethanol, the active ingredient in alcoholic beverages, and a key component in munitions. Now, Purity used the Harborside Commercial Street tank to offload molasses from ships and store it for later transfer by pipeline to the Purity ethanol plant situated between Willow Street and Evertees Way in Cambridge. The molasses tank itself stood 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter, and contained as much as 8.7 million liters of the molasses. Most of them came for import from various Caribbean and other countries. Now, on January 15, 1919, the temperature in that part of Boston had risen above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, climbing rapidly from the frigid temperatures of the previous days. And of course, the previous day a ship had delivered a fresh load of molasses, which was warmed to reduce its viscosity for transfer. Now, possibly due to the thermal expansion of the other coal molasses inside, the tank burst open and collapsed at approximately 12:30 p.m. Witnesses reported that they felt the ground shake and heard a roar as it collapsed, a long rumble similar to the passing of an elevated train. Others reported a tremendous crashing, a deep growling, a thunderclap like bang, and a machine gun-like sound as the rivets shot out of the tank. Now, because molasses' density is about 1.4 tons per cubic meter, 40% more dense than water, it had a great deal of potential energy. The collapse translated this energy into a wave of molasses, again 25 feet high at its peak, at 35 miles an hour. The wave was of sufficient force to drive steel panels of the burst tank against the grinders of the adjacent Boston Elevated Railway's Atlantic Avenue structure and tip a streetcar off the L's tracks. Now, Stephen Pullo describes how nearby buildings were swept off their foundations and crushed. Several blocks were flooded to a depth of 2 to 3 feet, and Pullo quotes a Boston Post report that molasses waist deep covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled to form. Whether it was an animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a trashing about in a sticky mess, showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky fly paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise. The Boston Globe reported that people were picked up by a rush of air and hurled many feet. Others had debris hurled at them from the rush of sweet-smelling air. A truck was picked up and hurled into Boston Harbor, and after the initial wave, the molasses became viscous, exacerbated by the cold temperatures, trapping those caught in a wave and making it even more difficult to rescue them. About 150 people were injured, and 21 people and countless horses were killed. Some were crushed and drowned by the molasses or by the debris that it carried within. The wounded include people, horses, and dogs, and coughing fits became the most common ailments after the initial blast. Now, first at the scene were 116 cadets under the direction of Lieutenant Commander H.J. Copeland from the USS Nantucket, a training ship of the Massachusetts Nautical School, now the Massachusetts Maritime Academy, that was docked nearby at the playground pier. They ran several blocks toward the accident and entered the knee-deep sticky mess to pull out the survivors, while others worked to keep the curious from getting in the way of the rescuers. Now, the Boston Police, Red Cross, Army, Navy personnel soon arrived. Some nurses from the Red Cross dived into the molasses, while others tended to the injured, keeping them warm and feeding the exhausted workers. Now, many of these people worked through the night, and the injured were so numerous that doctors and surgeons set up a triage in a nearby building. Rescuers found it difficult to make the way through the syrup to help the victims, and 4 days elapsed before they stopped searching. Many of the dead were so glazed over the molasses that they were hard to recognize. Other victims were swept into Boston Harbor and were found 3 to 4 months after the disaster. Now, local residents brought a class action lawsuit against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which had bought Purity Distilling in 1917. It was one of the first class action lawsuits in Massachusetts, and is considered a milestone in paving the way for modern corporate regulation. The company claimed that the tank had been blown up by anarchists because some of the alcohol produced was to be used in making munitions, but a court-appointed auditor found USIA responsible after 3 years of hearings, and the company ultimately paid out $628,000 in damages, comparable to 2019 figures of $10 million. Now, relatives of those killed reportedly received about $7,000 per victim, which is equivalent to $103,000 in 2020. Now, to clean it up, they used salt water from a fireboat to wash away the molasses and sand to absorb it, and the harbor was brown with molasses until summer. The cleanup in the immediate area took weeks, with numerous people contributing to the effort, and it took longer to clean the rest of Greater Boston and its suburbs. Rescue workers, cleanup crews, and sightseers had tracked molasses through the streets and spread it to subway platforms, to the seats inside trains and streetcars, to pay telephone handsets, into homes, and to countless other places. According to a reporter at the time, everything that a Bostonian touched that year was sticky. Now, fatalities included Patrick Breen, a laborer, William Brogan, a teamster, Bridget Cloutley, a homemaker, Stephen Cloutley, unemployed, John Callahan, a paver, Maria DeStasio, a child, William Duffy, a laborer, Peter Francis, a blacksmith, Flamino Gallerini, a driver, Pascale Unfascado, a child, James J. Canali, a laborer, Eric Laird, a teamster, George Leahy, a firefighter, James Leonard, a teamster, Ralph Martin, a driver, James McMullen, a foreman, Caesar Nicolo, an expressman, Thomas Noonan, a longshoreman, Peter Shaughnessy, a teamster, John M. Seilerbeck, a blacksmith, and Michael Sinat, a messenger. Now, several factors may have contributed to the disaster. The tank was poorly constructed and tested insufficiently, and carbon dioxide production may have been raised the internal pressure due to fermentation in the tank. Now, warmer weather the previous day also played a factor, and the failure occurred again from a manhole cover near the base of the tank and a fatigue crack that possibly grew to the point of criticality. Now, the tank had been filled to capacity only 8 times since it was built a few years before, pulling with the walls under an intermittent cyclical load. Now, an inquiry after disaster revealed that Arthur Gell, who was USIA's treasurer, neglected basic safety tests while overseeing construction of the tank, and he had no architectural or engineering experience. Now, a 2014 investigation applied modern engineering analysis, and it found that the steel was half as thick as it should have been for a tank of its size, even with the lax standards of today, and it also lacked manganese and was made more brittle as a result. Now, in 2016, a team of scientists and students at Harvard conducted extensive studies of the disaster, gathering data from many sources, including newspaper articles, old maps, and weather reports. The student researchers also studied the behavior of cold corn syrup, flooding a scale model of the affected neighborhood. The researchers concluded that the reports of the high speed of the flood were more than credible. Now, 2 days before the disaster, warm molasses, as was mentioned, had been added to the tank, reducing the viscosity of the fluid. Now, when the tank collapsed, the fluid cooled quickly as it spread until it reached Boston's winter evening temperatures, and the viscosity increased dramatically. The Harvard study concluded that the molasses cooled and thickened quickly and it rushed through the streets, hampering efforts to free victims before they suffocated. Now, the tank was not rebuilt. The property formerly occupied by the Molasses Tank and the North End Paving Company became a yard for the Boston Elevated Railway. It is now the site of a city-owned recreational complex, officially known as Langone Park, which features a Little League baseball field, a playground, and bocce courts. Now, immediately to the east is the larger Pupido Park with additional recreational facilities. Now, the accident has become a staple of local culture, not only for the damage that flood brought, but also for the sweet smell that filled the North End for decades after it occurred. According to journalist Edward Sparks, the smell of molasses remained for decades a distinctive, unmistakable atmosphere of Boston. Now, the accident has since been not say celebrated, but marked by its 100th anniversary on January 15, 2019, where a ceremony was held in remembrance. Now, ground-penetrating radar was also used to identify the exact location of the tank from 1919. The concrete slab base for the tank remains in place approximately 20 inches below the surface of the baseball diamond at Langdon Park. Attendees of the ceremony stood in a circle marking the edge of the tank, and the 21 names of those who died in the flood were read aloud. Now, many laws and regulations governing construction were changed as a direct result of disaster, including requirements for oversight by a licensed architect and civil engineer, which of course is applied to much construction, similar and otherwise, across North America. Now, there's been various cultural aspects. There's a book called I Survived the Great Molasses Flood, 1919, was written by the author Lauren Tarsis as part of the I Survived children's historical fiction book series, and numerous books have been talked about. Now, there was a similar, not say in disaster, but there was a molasses spill actually just a few years ago in Honolulu when 1,400 tons of molasses spilled into Honolulu Harbor. Now, the spill was discovered on 9 September 2013, caused by a faulty pipe for which a shipping company, Matson Navigation, took responsibility. Now, divers in the harbor area reported that all sea life in the area was killed by the molasses, which instantly sank to the bottom of the harbor and caused widespread deoxidization. Now, members of various coral species were injured or killed, and more than 26,000 fish and members of other marine species suffocated and died. Now, similar situations have occurred where there's been spills or explosions with food-based fluids, or items can be turned into food products. But the Boston Great Molasses Flood, because when I started to visit Massachusetts, where my wife lives, she's in the Solon Freetown area, I still don't believe this occurred. I said to myself, how in the name of God could molasses travel so fast? But I've been told by various people in my family that have followed the sciences, it's more than capable, because it includes the mass of the items, the quantity of the items, and the quality of the items, because this was high-end molasses. But I can imagine if that would never occur, obviously, in a modern area of Boston. But you can imagine you hear a boom and you think it's something, like thunder, and you see molasses coming to you. There's a lot of ways you can die in this world, but death by molasses, if it wasn't so real, it would be cruel and funny. But imagine death by molasses. There was nothing you could do, like you were probably stuck before it hit you. But anyway, it's part of Massachusetts and Boston legacy, and like I said, we present this information as a public service, not to exploit the situation, but just to let the people know that unfortunately this occurred, and the only good thing came from it is a change of regulations that have saved many lives actually over the years. So that's the story of the Great Molasses Flood. Have a good day. Bye.